The International Monetary Fund has forced Kenya to convert its dollar-denominated loans, SGR loans, to the Chinese currency, to the Chinese yuan. And this is what the economic advisor to the president had to say. The Western lenders questioned why, that is the IMF, questioned why they ought to help us while other lenders were taking out the money. For this reason, they exert pressure on nations to restructure their debts so that the funds they invest remain in the nation rather than being used to pay off other lenders. David Ndie explained as reported by Business Daily. Now, in this video, we're going to look at the good side and the ugly side to this and whether the SGR loan makes sense. Now, first, we need to understand what is happening here. Kenya, back in 2014, 2015, reached out to China. Kenya had an ambitious project to construct the SGR. That is the standard gauge railway from Mombasa to Nairobi, from Nairobi to Naivasha, from Naivasha to Malaba. So far, we received around $5 billion US dollars. $5 billion US dollars, in as much as it's from China. Now, these loans are meant to be paid in US dollars. And the argument that IMF is making, why should we lend you money that is meant for development, that is meant to support your budget, that is meant to make economic reforms, and the funds that you receive are being used to pay off another loan, to pay off another lender. There's no benefit to that. You're not benefiting. You're just taking a loan to pay off another loan. In this new arrangement, the loans that we took from China that were meant for the SGR, in as much as they're supposed to be paid in US dollars, we are now going to be paying them in the Chinese currency instead of the US dollars that we receive, or partly we receive, from the IMF. So the good side is this. We took a loan, around 5 billion loan, back in 2014, 2015. So far, we owe China around 3.5 billion. So we've been paying off these debts. This $3.5 billion is the one that has been converted to the Chinese yuan. Now, the loan that we took back then was a variable interest loan. It depends on the market. It depends on how the market is performing. So let me just show you this equation that puts everything into perspective. The interest rate that we were supposed to pay was the LIBOR, or the SOFR, plus 3% to 3.6%. Now, this rate here, known as SOFR, is the global benchmark interest rate for dollar-denominated loans globally. So if this interest rate increases, then the general interest rate that we're going to be paying on this loan also increases. This is what has been happening. Between 2015 to 2019, remember we took these loans back in 2014, 2015, the base rate, the US base rate, was around 1%. Now, this is just an illustration to show you how Kenya is going to benefit, is that it was around 1%. This data is not that accurate, okay? It's just for illustration purposes, but it's based on the current market conditions then. In 2015 to 2019, the SOFR base rate was around 1%. So China was to add around 3% margin on top in this interest rate. So we were supposed to pay around 4%. But in 2023, between 2023 to date, it turns out that this rate, the US benchmark rate that is being used to calculate the interest on these loans, went up. In this case, it went up by 4%. So if the 3% that were being charged by China remains the same, the 3%, but the global conditions have changed, because when you look at what happened between 2023 to date, is that the US increased their interest rates. In that, we're trying to reduce inflation. A lot of money was circulating in the market, and this is what made the interest rates on even loans that you take go up in order to fight inflation. So the interest that we are paying, since it depends on this rate, and the US has influenced this rate to go up, you can see that we are paying a lot for this bond. Now, what was reported by Treasury was that the interest rate with the current terms, that is, if you were to pay these loans in US dollars, is above 6%. And back then, it was around 4%. So you can see that increment. And if we go ahead and pay these loans in US dollars, we don't have to depend on this rate, this US benchmark rate, the SOFR rate, because the loans are not denominated in US dollars. We don't care. Allow me to say that. We don't care what is happening in the US, because we are now paying these loans in the Chinese currency. So you can see that you are benefiting. And the number that Treasury gave us was around $215 million. This is what Kenya would save. We pay interest on these SGR loans twice a year, in January and July. And this is how much we are going to save. This is a lot of money, $215 million. You can see Kenya is definitely going to save in terms of interest payments. So it turns out that we being forced to convert these loans is a good thing on our side, because we get to benefit. Now, I want to bring to your attention something else that is related to this. This is the first time in history that a sovereign debt that is denominated in US dollars has been converted to the Chinese yuan. This has never happened before on any African loan from China. And it turns out that other countries like Ethiopia are also exploring similar arrangements. We've just set a historic precedent. What if it turns out that other African nations that owe China money, and they have to pay them back in US dollars, now have to pay them in the Chinese yuan, in the Chinese currency? Think of it globally. What would happen? Because this is a substantial, in as much as it's a small move towards changing how global finance works. Because most of the trade that happens globally, and even loans, is usually done in US dollars. So the US dollar is the main currency. Even when we buy goods from China, when we import items from Japan, the main currency that is being used to settle international trade, international finance, is usually in US dollars. Something else that I forgot to mention was that Treasury estimated the payment of these loans to be around 3%. The 3% that I showed you in the diagram is what we are going to be paying for this loan, around 3% there. So you can see us paying 3% to a loan than paying more than 6%, because that is what they reported in US dollars, is going to benefit Kenya. Let me also bring to your attention that back in June this year, June 2025, Treasury was exploring the idea of issuing a Panda bond. So this is a bond that is denominated in the Chinese currency, a similar way that the government issues Euro bonds. So these are bonds, or rather, this is us going to the international market and issuing bonds that are denominated in US dollars, the same way that we have treasury bonds here in Kenya, but money is being raised in Kenyan shillings. So a Euro bond is in US dollars, a Panda bond is in the Chinese currency. That was back in June 2025, and this was an anticipation that we had back then, and this bond was specifically, or was supposed to be used to construct the SGR. We took a loan back in 2015, 2014 to construct the SGR from Nairobi, or rather from Mombasa to Nairobi, and from Nairobi to Naivasha. So this bond that was supposed to be issued was supposed to help us construct the SGR from Naivasha to Malaba. But it turns out, according to the reports by Treasury, that they had to let go of this bond because the Chinese offered unfavorable terms. What did they see? Because if you're going to the bank to take a loan, for example, it's for a business, for you expanding a business, they have to look at your risk profile. They have to look at, can we be able to recover this amount? Does this business bring in enough cash flow that we can be confident that we won't risk losing our money? Do you risk defaulting? So those are some of the things that they look out for. So if China was hesitant or gave us unfavorable terms that we have to pay a higher interest rate on this Panda bond that they were to issue, then what did they see? Does this standard gauge railway make sense, especially constructing from Naivasha to Malaba? I'm just thinking of some of the things that they would have in mind. What does the cash flow look like? What is the risk profile? So eventually, Treasury did not issue the Panda loan. As of yesterday, the CS for transport confirmed that they are thinking about taking a 15-year bond to finance this project, to finish up this project from Naivasha to Malaba. And this is what the CS for transport had to say. We have a good stream from the Railway Development Levy, which is ring-fenced to build the railway. But if you look at it from a cash flow perspective, it's not enough to build the railway in 2 or 3 years, he told reporters on Friday. So they are mainly targeting to finish off this construction in the next 2 to 3 years. It doesn't make sense to use the Railway Development Levy. This is a type of levy that is imposed on all goods that are imported into the country. So if you're importing anything, then you have to pay up this levy, which is 2%. It used to be 1% back in 1.5% back in 2024. So it's not enough to construct this. That's why they are thinking about issuing a 15-year bond. He continues to say that we will basically look at financial markets and the available instruments, leveraging. So we're talking about loans, of course, or the RDLF revenues, the railway development revenues. A railway should attract long-term borrowing, and we are looking at 15-year facility. The 2% railway development levy charge is sufficient to support us. So they're thinking about issuing this bond. Now, as a Kenyan, I have questions. And my question is that, should we really construct, or should we really finish up with this project, and must we finish up with this project in the next 2 to 3 years? Does the SGR make economic sense? Politically, it might make sense. It might make sense. But I'm just thinking about the cost and benefits. And that as a country, we have to take on loans and we have to pay back these loans. We have to pay interest on top of these loans. So I'll just think about the cost and benefit. Should we even have thought of the SGR in the first place? Is it a good investment? Of course, we're supposed to look at the cash flow that comes from this. We're supposed to do the maths. We're supposed to have some numbers so that we can support whether this is a good or bad investment. Just looking at it from afar, that the Panda loan that was supposed to construct this SGR had unfavorable terms, and that the levy that we currently have is not sufficient enough to support or finish up this construction in the next 2 to 3 years. Is this a good investment long term? What do you think? I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments.